Don't eat that. You heard her shout. Hoping that she wasn't talking to you, you began frantically scanning the surrounding area for someone, anyone else, that could possibly be the focus of her imperative. And much to your relief, your eyes finally fell on a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5. And with a quivering chin and a startled look on his face, it seemed as though he had been caught, about to cram what appeared to be the remnants of a melting ice cream cone into his mouth. But why not? He said in desperation. Because it has been on the ground, and it is gross and germy, his mother replied. And then he said what any child would say in such a dire set of circumstances. But Mom, the 5-second rule. And at this, your eyes accidentally locked onto the eyes of the mother. And you didn't know what else to do, so you offered a unhelpful shoulder shrug and a sheepish smile. You really can't argue with his universal logic, right? I mean, if I dropped an ice cream cone on the ground, it's not going to be on the ground for 5 seconds, but I'm also not going to try to eat it. And what happened next was intense argumentation, the likes of which any litigator would have been proud. All the while, the ice cream cone continued to melt. Finally, it was mutually agreed upon that, indeed, the ice cream cone was likely gross and could not be eaten. Mom reached over and gently wrapped it in a napkin and threw it in the closest trash can. And then off they went to buy a replacement ice cream cone. Seems like everyone won. Now, we all know that the 5-second rule has important caveats, limitations, and nuances that only come with age. There are important things to understand, not the least of which is which foods are impacted by the 5-second rule and which ones are not. A chocolate chip cookie is safe. An iced cookie that lands icing side down, not so much. A potato chip, perfectly fine. A tortilla chip with dip on it? Indeed, no. And context is also critical. 5 seconds really only applies when you're at home or at a friend's house, unless, of course, no one's looking. And then there are people who really don't like the 5-second rule at all. To them, it's just utter nonsense. Once food hits the ground or the table, for them, it's game over. So situational awareness is also really important when it comes to the 5-second rule. And yes, indeed, I have given this much thought. Welcome to my brain. It's a rather odd place. Now, in our text this morning from 1 Corinthians, relax, we don't have a conversation about the 5-second rule and how it does or doesn't apply in certain settings and situations, but what we do have is a conversation about food and eating habits and dining rituals and cultural customs. And before we dive into the texts themselves, I think it's important for us to understand something about the audience of the letter. These two texts that we call 1 Corinthians are a part of a much larger conversation between the Apostle Paul and the church in the city of ancient Corinth. Paul spent as much as 18 months working as a literal tent maker and church planter in this bustling city of commerce and trade. And scholars believe he wrote 4 or maybe more letters to the church. 2 Corinthians, in fact, is actually a collection of many of the fragments of these letters. And it's safe to say, from all that we know, that Paul loved this community. Corinth is located on a small isthmus that connects mainland Greece to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It is here that ancient mariners would dock their ships and literally roll their ships on logs across to the other side and drop them back into the sea. And there's a small canal there now. This saved sailors some 400 nautical miles of treacherous sailing around the peninsula as they traveled from the Aegean Sea to the Ionian Sea, or vice versa. And it was here that they would restock their supplies and enjoy everything that Corinth had to offer: olives and grapes, fine wine, finer food, and much more. Let's just say what happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth. Because of the trade and diversity, Corinth was a crossroads of the ancient world where cultures and people and philosophies and religions would intersect and intermingle. There were temples, statues, altars, a synagogue, and a church. And this city became an important part of Paul's missionary journeys. It was a place from which the gospel could spread far and wide. And it presented some unique opportunities and, indeed, some challenges. And that brings us to our texts. And they are strange texts to our modern ears as they speak about food being offered before images. Now, these weren't just foods offered as sacrifices in the temples to other gods, as our English translation might suggest. But these foods likely are also foods that were presented to the ancestors as a part of funeral celebrations, family gatherings at mausoleums and cemeteries. According to Bruce Molina and John Pilch, this included foods offered to idols and images, whether they be gods or other statues, or busts, statues, and death masks of relatives. So the question that came up was if a follower of the way of Jesus was in a place where such food was offered to them, likely meat, which would have been rare, were they free to partake? The short answer, according to Paul, was, of course, yes. His argument was based on the knowledge that there is only one God, and eating meat offered in any other setting was of no threat to that belief and understanding of God. As we heard, he wrote to the Corinthians, "We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do." And again, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the grounds of conscience. For the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. Eat and be free of conscience. However, much like the 5-second rule, there is a caveat, a limitation, a nuance, if you will. Individual liberty, freedom to do as one pleases, should never overshadow corporate responsibility. In this same letter to the church in Corinth, Paul writes, "All things are lawful, but all things are not beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Do not seek your own advantage, but that of others. Knowledge puffs up, love builds up." He is saying that their conscience is indeed free before the one God, but be cautious. Take care. This liberty, this independence does not somehow then become a stumbling block or a hindrance to someone else's thriving. Now, it's easy to imagine someone defending their freedom, their liberties, by saying, "Why should I care? What concern it is of mine if someone else struggles with that which I am free in my conscience to do?" And indeed, that is the rub. For Paul, responsibility for others was paramount if the community was going to survive. And individuals within it were going to thrive. It is a balance of individual freedom and corporate responsibility, concern for the well-being, the thriving of the other. You see, love edifies. Love builds up. Love cares for the other. It is love that is at the center. It is love that radiates out to the margins. It is love that is the gravitational force of community that pulls all things toward that beautiful center. Love is the first, the primary ethic of community. So the question for us, is, what does this look like in reality, in today's world? Ready to potentially have your mind blown? Your perspective reset? This study, this preparing for this sermon, changed the way I see this text. It actually impacted the way I see the entire letter. For Paul tells us exactly what it looks like in action. Now, it's a familiar text. It's one that runs the risk of being overused. In fact, it has nearly become cliche. But with all of this now as the background, it takes on new meaning, new veracity. At least it has for me. So what does this love that is at the center look like? This is what Paul wrote. And now I will show you a still more excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a noising gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have all prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all of my possessions, if I surrender my body so that I may boast but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. Love is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put childish ways behind me. For now we see in a mirror dimly. But then we shall see face to face. Now we only know in part, and then we will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now, faith, hope, and love abide. These three. But the greatest of these is love. It's love. It's our corporate responsibility. Love. It's the first ethic of community. It's what is at the center, and it holds all things together. To God be the glory.